I was driving home from a late night shift when I saw a man standing on the side of a road. He was a tall, thin man with a scraggly beard and dark, piercing eyes that seemed to follow me as I drove past him. I don't know why, but something compelled me to turn back and offer him a ride. He climbed into my car without a word, and I felt a knot form in my stomach as we drove down the deserted road. The silence was suffocating, and every now and then he would turn and stare at me with these cold, dead eyes. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I regretted ever stopping to pick him up. As we approached a dark, wooded area, he suddenly asked me to pull over. My heart started racing. I complied, and he got out of the car without a word. I sat there watching as he disappeared into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps slowly fading away. I wanted to leave, but something told me to wait. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I heard a car pull up behind me. A police officer got out, gun drawn, and asked me if I had seen a man matching the hitchhiker's description. It turned out that the man that I had picked up was a criminal who was convicted of manslaughter just days before. He had been on the run ever since, and the police were desperately searching for him. I shivered at the thought of what could have happened to me. The story took place 2 years ago. I was on my second week backpacking through Austria, and I reached a point where I was too exhausted to walk any longer. It was a usual hot day. I had blisters all over my feet and I was ready to call it quits. I was in the middle of nowhere and decided to take a lift to the nearest train station, but I was out of luck. I stood there for what felt like hours and no car would pick me up. And I don't blame them. I spent 2 weeks sleeping in the woods, my clothes were dirty, and I probably looked like a maniac. When finally a truck pulled up, I didn't hesitate to hop inside because I was so thankful to be able to sit down and rest my feet for a while. I asked the driver if he could drop me off at the nearest station so that I could catch a train to Vienna, but he told me that he was heading back there anyway, and that he could take me there as long as I didn't mind him making a stopover to load the truck. I didn't, and so we drove along. We made some small talk and he seemed to be very polite. It was a pretty enjoyable ride until we reached the first stop. He loaded his truck while I walked around a bit and bought some water at a gas station nearby. He had offered me drinks a few times along the ride, but I always declined because I don't feel comfortable with that. I got back into the truck and we continued the drive to Vienna. Almost immediately after we took off again, he told me that it wouldn't be a problem for him if I wanted to take off some of my clothes, since it was such a hot day. I told him that I was fine, but he brought it up a couple more times. He also asked me if I wanted to take a nap in the back, and that he had several hitchhikers sleeping there in the past. I declined again and started to feel a little uneasy around him, and planned to leave the truck at the next gas station. All of a sudden, he nearly yelled at me to put my head down and hide because he was driving past his stepfather's car and he didn't want him to see me in the car. That struck me as odd, but I did anyway because his yelling took me by surprise. That confirmed my resolution to get out of there as soon as possible, and I asked him to drop me off at the next stop and made up an excuse that it was my goal to enter Vienna by foot, and that I was well rested enough to make it. He agreed and I got my stuff ready. He suddenly turned to me and said that I looked familiar and that he was sure he saw me somewhere before. I shrugged it off, but he insisted he remembered my face. He asked me if I ever went to a swinger club because he was sure he saw me there sometime. That caught me off guard and I told him that this was impossible because I've never been to one. "Well, do you want to? I'm going to one in Vienna. Let's go there together. I'm sure you'll like it." At this point, I really wanted to get off the truck ASAP, and told him that I had no intention to come with him and asked him to drop me off now. He didn't answer, but reached into his pants and started masturbating while he drove along. I froze up, clutching my backpack on my lap and didn't know what to do. I kept thinking that I'd jump off as soon as he stopped somewhere and tried to ignore what he was doing there since he didn't respond to my plea to let me out. A gas station was coming up and he stopped what he was doing and asked if we should take a shower together. I figured that there'd be people around and that it would make it easier to get rid of him, so I told him sure, why not. He pulled up and as soon as he stopped, I yanked open the door and ran across the parking area of the gas station, hoping that he wouldn't come after me. He didn't, so I just kept running until the station was out of sight, and I reached a busy street. Only after my heart stopped racing and I catched my breath did I realize that I left my shoes at the truck. I walked the last few kilometers bare feet and kept a lookout for the truck until I reached Vienna. I live upstate in New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit, and one morning before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years older than me, but during this particular fight, he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, why don't you go back to the fucking Bronx?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew out of the house. I am, unfortunately, an impulsive ass and didn't think to grab my phone before I stormed out. I didn't drive, so my only option was to walk. I didn't think at the time that I intended to walk back to the Bronx, as it was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for an angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me, as I had only lived there a few months at that point, and we really didn't go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then boyfriend driving by on his way to work, and he sped up as he drove past me, evidently still angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow and I was losing momentum. I passed by a VFW where a pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I passed it that I even realized the driver was in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey honey, do you need some help?" My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept the stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was a clean-cut, seemingly normal older white guy, gray hair, greenish blue eyes, just average. "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" I cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. He answered, "Ha, I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy." I ignored the bells going off in my head and got into the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask her where the hell I was going. I called her 3 times, and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx and that I had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused and said, "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously and said, "Oh no, thanks though." He responded, "Well, I just figured since you said you were from the Bronx," and trailed off. Realizing at that point that I was almost definitely in deep shit, I muttered, "Oh, sure." He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering, Sure, she says." I started to panic big time, but knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank that I could land in if I leapt out of the truck to no avail. The houses were so few and far in between, I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name and her husband's full name. He instantly perked up and explained that he knew the husband and how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving in the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name. "Steve," he said, then asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a bullshit thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed to the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house trying to find my friend's mom. I had woken her from a sound sleep, but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything. The fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his sexual proposition. and she listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do something so reckless again, and that if she needed her, to call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day and got really stoned to try to forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had cut off communications with years ago. The last he had heard about Steve was that he had been arrested for sexual assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road, and no one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might not have been found until the snow thawed out.